This is Father David Cotter. I'm in the choir loft actually at St. Columba with some very generous parishioners who've volunteered to help me do this. And what they're helping me do is not preach on the readings for this coming weekend, but sort of walk you through them. It'll be a little bit more like me teaching you about the readings than about us listening to the readings in a liturgical setting and then hearing me preach a homily about them. But I thought it might be helpful to us as we watch Masses live streamed on the weekend during this time when we're all sort of at home living quiet lives. I thought it would help you understand the readings better and get into them more. Now, it may be the case that you have a Sunday Missal at home. You may have a Heritage Missal at home. If you don't, feel free to ask me to drop one off, and I'll drop one off at your home so you can follow this more closely, or you may have it on your phone or on your computer somehow. But the readings that I'm going to be talking about today are from the 5th Sunday of Lent, Year A, and the first reading is from the book of the prophet Ezekiel. The second reading is from the letter of St. Paul to the Romans, and the third reading is from the Gospel according to John. So let's just walk through them a little bit. The first reading is taken from the book of the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 37, as it happens, 37, 12 through 14. And at this point, the situation that Ezekiel and the people of Israel are living through is this. Jerusalem has been destroyed. Israel lost a terrible war, and as a result, Jerusalem was destroyed, and in line with custom of the day, the losing side got dispersed. If I'm the ruler now, I beat you in war, and I want to keep you pacific, well, I don't let you sit at home and think about how to rebel against you. I bring you to where I am, sit you down, and you live there in captivity. That's what had happened to the people of Israel. So they'd been driven out of the Holy Land, they'd been driven away from Israel, and now they are essentially in camps in what we would call Iraq, and centered around Babylon, which is a suburb of what we call Baghdad. And they've been there for some time. Ezekiel's writing towards the end of their period in that captivity, because eventually it will come to an end and they'll go home. And he's trying to help the people understand that all is not lost. That although they have been destroyed, although they have lost many, many family members, although everything that's familiar to them is gone, they'll be able once again to live as a people. Now, the reading talks about, you might be familiar with it, this is the vision of the Valley of Dry Bones. So Ezekiel sees a vision, and extended as far as he can see is just a plain full of dry bones, and it seems like there's no life, there's no possibility of these people living again, these people being a nation once again. And he assures them that appearances to the contrary, they will. Thus says the Lord God, O my people, I will open your graves and have you rise from them and bring you back to the land of Israel. Now, he's not talking about going to heaven. This is not a spiritual meaning that he's associating with these words. He means that the political entity that is Israel will once again be real in this world. Now, we hear this because it's true, for one reason. A very famous literary scholar named George Steiner died recently, and he was asked, although he was not a believer, he was Jewish, and he was asked whether or not he thought the people of Israel were indeed the chosen people. And he said something like this. He said, did you ever meet a Thracian? Did you ever meet a Phrygian? Did you ever meet... And he went through a list of ancient peoples who have disappeared from the world. Now, it may be that their genes are still cooking around somewhere, but as an entity, as a self-conscious living political entity, you'll never meet a Thracian. You'll never meet a Phrygian. You will meet an Israelite. You will meet a person who is Jewish. And that was indeed Steiner's point. There is something about the Jewish people that, despite all the things that all sorts of other peoples have tried to do to them over the centuries, they continue to endure, they continue to live, they continue to exist. So Israel is a nation once again. So the prophet Ezekiel was about 500 years before the birth of Jesus, telling the people that despite the dire circumstances in which they currently found themselves, once again, they would go home, they would live, they would be a people. Now that's one thing that you can glean from this reading from the book of the prophet Ezekiel. The other thing you can glean from it is in line with our Christian understanding of resurrection. Just as the people of Israel came to life again, resurrected, lived again, so too it is an essential part of Christian belief that we come to life again, we live again. So death is not an end. Political death was not an end for the people of Israel thousands of years ago, and our own mortality is not the end for us. Once again, somehow, God will bring us to life again, just as he brought the people of Israel to life again. And so then we turn to the second reading. And the second reading that we're listening to this weekend comes from the letter of St. Paul to the Romans, chapter 8, verses 8 through 11. Now let me read a little bit of this to you, because it has a different meaning than the apparent obvious meaning. And Paul writes this, brothers and sisters, "Those who are in the flesh cannot please God, but you are not in the flesh. On the contrary, you're in the Spirit. Finally, the Spirit of God dwells in you. Whatever does not have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to you. If Christ is in you, although the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is alive because of righteousness." Now, what Paul is doing at this point, this is the last letter that he wrote, so around the year 50. What Paul is doing at this point is developing a theological vocabulary. He's the first, in a very real sense, Christian theologian. He's trying to think about the nature of God and the relationship of God to us. And so he needs a vocabulary, he needs a language in which to describe this. And the language that he lands on is this: we as human beings are made up of several different things, according to Paul. We have a body. In Paul's language, body is neither morally good nor morally bad. It's just a fact. We all have a body. That's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing, it's not a dangerous thing, it's not a virtuous thing, it's just a fact. We are all enfleshed. We all have a body. But our body houses two tendencies, if you will. One of those tendencies is what Paul calls the spirit. The other tendency is what Paul calls flesh. Now, that doesn't mean our physicality is a bad thing. The flesh is a bad thing. What Paul's doing is trying to find standard language to talk about two realities in human life. One reality in human life is that we are given to selfishness. That's what Paul means when he talks about the flesh. The other reality in human life is that we are capable of selflessness. That's what Paul is talking about when he talks about the Spirit. So we, in our bodies, are tugged in two directions. We're tugged to live selfishly, we're tugged to live selflessly. Now, in recent days, we've seen all sorts of people who, at least from our perspective, our vantage point as an outsider to their lives, seem either to be behaving in an awfully selfish fashion or an awfully selfless fashion. I just read this morning about a priest in northern Italy who was elderly and had come down with the coronavirus and was very ill. And a friend of his bought him his own respirator, his own ventilator. Now, he needed this to live. He became aware of a young person that he didn't know that didn't have access to this medical device, so he gave it away. He gave it away knowing that that would almost inevitably mean that he would die, and he did die. I mean, can you think of a more selfless act than that? Here, this is helping me live. I will give it to you because you're younger. You have your whole life ahead of you. You need this, so I give it to you. That's what Paul is always talking about when he contrasts flesh and spirit. The flesh is what draws us to live selfishly. The spirit is what draws us to live selflessly. Now, Paul's idea is this: if throughout the course of our Christian lives we cooperate more and more with the life of the Spirit, it gets stronger, because the Spirit is Christ living in us through baptism. When we're baptized, when we become a member of the church, Christ lives in us. And Christ lives more strongly in us as we celebrate the sacraments, as we receive the sacraments. Christ lives more strongly in us as we pray, as we foster our life of spirituality. Christ becomes stronger in us, and Christ becomes stronger in us when we practice what we say we believe. As we practice living selflessly, we get better at living selflessly. So this elderly priest in northern Italy, in Bergamo, this priest in northern Italy was, at the end of his life, utterly selfless. Here, I give this to you. Now, the same task is laid out before all of us. Our task as human beings is to live more and more in the Spirit. That is to say, live more and more selflessly. It doesn't mean that our physicality is a bad thing. That's not what it means at all. It means that we are drawn to live selflessly. And we find, particularly in these days, all sorts of examples of that selfless life around us. So Paul is telling in this letter to the Romans, the church at Rome, that this is our task, this is our goal in life, to live increasingly selflessly, to live increasingly in accord with the Spirit of God within us. And then we turn to the gospel. Now, the gospel this Sunday is the raising of Lazarus. Just a couple of words about who Lazarus was and the role that he played in Jesus' life. Jesus had 3 friends. Doubtless he had many other friends, but he has 3 friends that are particularly known to us. His friends, Mary and Martha, and their brother Lazarus. Now, in the Benedictine tradition that I was part of for so many years, in the Benedictine tradition, Mary and Martha and Lazarus have their own feast day, the feast of Saints Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, the friends of the Lord. So that was their role in his life. It wasn't their vocation to go off to preach the gospel. It wasn't their vocation to do the sort of big heroic things that we think we're called to do sometimes in our lives. Their role in Jesus' life was just to be his friends. So when Jesus was in Bethany where they lived, he had a place to stop in. And we find that wonderful tale of Jesus stopping in and visiting Mary and Martha. And Martha bustles off to the kitchen to get him what he likes to eat. And Mary just sits there to have a chat. And it's just a wonderful scene. So Mary and Martha had a brother named Lazarus. And Lazarus grew ill. And it took Jesus several days to get from where he was to where Lazarus was. And by the time he got there, Lazarus had passed away. So Lazarus is dead. It's hot. Lazarus is buried very rapidly. So by the time Jesus has gotten there, his very good, close friend, his friend Lazarus, is dead and in the tomb. The sisters come out and say, if you'd been here, he might not have died because you could have healed him. And Jesus says, he'll rise at the end of time just like we all will. And they say, we know that, we know that. And then Jesus goes to visit the tomb. The sisters confess their faith in the resurrection, and then Jesus goes to visit the tomb. And the most striking thing happens as he visits the tomb. He stands in front of the tomb, and he's grieving. And then there's a verb used, which is only used 2 other times in the New Testament, and it's not clear what it means. What it literally means is a horse snorting in anger. So imagine that scene for yourself. Imagine a horse that's all riled up, that's all bothered, that's afraid that something is happening to, and that horse rears up and snorts and is angry. Now, that's the verb that's used to describe Jesus' reaction when he stands in front of the tomb. What on earth does that mean? Now, in our translation, it simply says, he was moved with the deepest emotion. Clearly. But what did that emotion look like? Other translations say that he was sort of shuddering. He was sort of just physically overcome by his grief. Now, Lazarus was his very good friend. And so Jesus is mourning the death of his very good friend. Now, if Jesus is, as we Christians believe, God present among us, and if God is all perfections in an infinite way, that means that probably for the first time in all infinity, the infinitely joyful heart of God, because joy is a perfection, so God is infinite joy. The infinitely joyful heart of God knows what we know all too well. He knows what grief is. He knows what loss is. He knows that very particular human pain when someone to whom you're close is no longer part of your life because they've passed away. And so Jesus stands before the tomb of his good friend, and he's just overwhelmed by grief. And that being overwhelmed by grief has a physical aspect to it as well. He's just shuddering, trembling with grief. Now, Jesus calls Lazarus out of the tomb, and Lazarus comes. But this is not a resurrection. Lazarus would die again. This is Lazarus coming to life. This is not Lazarus being raised to life in the resurrection. But it gives us a hint of what Jesus is talking about when he calls himself the resurrection and the life. So when Jesus calls Lazarus forth from the tomb, and the people around him confess their faith in him as the resurrection and the life, we get a small hint of what resurrection is like. And that's why this gospel is read to us at this point during the Lenten season. We're encouraged by Ezekiel to think that once again, that which is dead comes to life. We're reminded by Paul that as we live more and more selflessly, as we live more and more spiritual lives, not unphysical lives, but as we live more and more selfless lives, as Christ comes to live more in us, then when inevitably, as we all do, we pass away, what happened to Lazarus is a mere hint of what will happen with us. We'll be who we were always intended to be. We will be as alive as Jesus is alive, because Jesus lives in us. So, Ezekiel pointed towards resurrection. Paul points towards resurrection. Lazarus points us towards resurrection. But Jesus is resurrection. And so whenever we receive the Eucharist during this Lenten season, during the upcoming Easter festivities, Jesus, who is resurrection itself, comes to live in us. And we come to live in him.